Well, we have a very busy forum here, people from all over the world. So it's now time. I'm just going to start with the warm-up. Some people already raised their hand. Just give me a moment to see if you actually need to speak, because we are almost 200 attendees today. So really big webinar. So let me just start a couple of slides and then see if you still have open questions. So welcome everybody to this webinar. Today we are here to welcome Elke Bojanowski from Egypt. She's dialing in from Egypt today to talk about the Oceanic White Tip Sharks of the Red Sea and in general about the Oceanic White Tips. Many of you know her, I think, and so you know how knowledgeable she is about this topic. Just before we call her to join us, a couple words about Insider Divers. If you don't know us, we're a company that organizes land-based and liveaboard scuba diving trips. We do general scuba diving trips like here on this picture in the Red Sea, but we also do specific trips, particularly like wreck trips where we would have tech and wreck, for example, but also freediving snorkeling trips, say with whales or animals like that, and specific photography workshops. So we have all these different kind of trips that we organize. They're always group trips, so we don't do individual travel, we just do groups. There's always an expert traveling with you, so somebody like a photographer or a scientist or an instructor. So there's always people there to make sure that our specific itineraries work. We try to provide itineraries that are maybe harder to organize by yourself, and the experts are there to help you get this experience. One thing that's super important for our trips is education and coaching. So on all of our trips we try to learn something. We might have talks like this one, that's how we met Elke anyway, but we might also have trainings or talks with local scientists or a beach clean or anything like that, because we believe you should never stop learning. And because we're all stuck at home due to the coronavirus, we started what we call Insider Academy. That is basically a series of webinars. We've been doing this now since April. So we've got all kinds of webinars, about 3 a week. We've got like specific things like Lightroom. We have a whole series on Lightroom. We've got a whole series on underwater photography, specific things on manta rays, specific ones on sharks, and all of these will be either on insideracademy.com or on our YouTube channel. So also Elke's talk, if you really liked it and you would like to share it with other people, there will be a Facebook recording and there will also be a YouTube recording, and you can find it on our channel and then you can share it. So without further ado, I'm going to first say a couple words about Zoom. I don't know if it's your first time or not. Lots of people now getting more and more experience with these webinar softwares. So first of all, you're all turned off, right? There's now 240 attendees. So therefore everybody's turned off, otherwise it would become very noisy in here. And we will keep it that way. Now, most of the time, what I would prefer is if you could put your questions in the Q&A. So if you look into your menu bar, there is somewhere a Q&A segment, and in this Q&A box I would like you to put your questions, because while Elke is talking I will manage the questions for her, so she doesn't have to keep track of them. You can also put them in the chat, but you know, there's also people saying hello to each other and etc, etc. So if you have specific questions towards the content of the presentation, I would prefer it if you could put it in the Q&A. And also you can raise your hand when you feel that you really want to speak up and ask a question in person. I would prefer, though, in order to keep it roughly in time, that you wait with raising your hand until a little bit later, because when we all speak, it's just going to take a lot longer. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Elke Bojanowski. I actually have been diving with Elke now for 4 years. And my first dives with Oceanic White Tips was with Elke. So you could say 90% of what I know about these sharks were from Elke. And we've dived together in the Red Sea and in the Maldives. And we've got the same kind of idea that people should learn and understand more about the animals. And I just love her talks. And that's why I asked her to join us today. She's also here already. Hi, Elke.
Hello.
So dialing in from Egypt, welcome, welcome. We've got 250 people logged in.
Oh.
So that is a new record for our webinars. So you can be Very proud about that. So thanks, guys, for joining. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself and take over the screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, so my name is Elke. Welcome, everybody. And yeah, also thank you for Simon for this whole idea. I never done a webinar, so that's the first time. So I find myself talking to my screen and have to imagine that I'm actually talking to about 250 people. So a new one, so yeah, bear with me. Thank you, Simon. So let's hope this all works out and everybody enjoys this webinar. Subject you see on the screen, and we talked about it. Oceanic White Tip Sharks, specifically in the Red Sea, but also a little bit in general. Who am I exactly and why am I talking about them? So a bit more about myself, apart from what Simon already said. So a bit of an introduction. I am a German biologist. I made a PhD in biology in 2002. That was focusing on the behavior of bottlenose dolphins, actually. So I started off with marine mammals and marine ecology, actually. Then in 2004, through the diving in with it, I'm a PADI dive master. So I started to work on Egyptian liverboards with the interest of basically being able to do some biological projects. The biological project that jumped at me basically was the Oceanics, the Oceanic White Tips. I started meeting them on a regular basis about 6 months after I started in Egypt, so that was October. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more why it was so obvious for me to start studying them actually as a biologist. That's going to come a bit later. But just in short, I started what I then called the Longimanus project, started collecting data on these Oceanics while continuing as a guide in Egypt. And that's pretty much what I'm doing until today. I expanded the research in 2010, took on a couple more shark species here in Egypt, a general shark monitoring program as well, and then founded the Red Sea Shark Trust pretty much as an umbrella organization for the research project in 2012. Second goal of the Red Sea Shark Trust, beside the research, is actually to increase the awareness of people, mainly of divers, about shark conservation. Yeah, I think that is really, really important. That's also one of the subjects I want to talk to you about today. So this is who I am, and this is why I'm talking about the Oceanics. So a bit more detail, what are the different subjects I want to talk about today? So a bit of an outline of what you can expect from this webinar. I'm going to start off by talking about the Oceanics in general. Yeah, some biological facts. In a lot of ways, Oceanics are very typical sharks, but of course in other ways they're very special, which is why there's a whole webinar only about them. And the reason why they're special actually can be understood quite simply from knowing something about their ecology and their biology. So I'm going to start off with that one first. Also to introduce them in general as a species, because I'm not assuming that everybody that joined today has actually any experience with them or knows a lot about them. I know a lot of you do. You've been with me also on liverboards with Oceanics, but I'm sure there's a few people that never have this experience. So just to get everybody on the same page. And then I want to talk about diving with Oceanics. Yeah, of course, I think the majority of people here are divers, a lot of them probably underwater photographers as well. So diving with sharks is a big subject anyway, but as mentioned, the Oceanics are quite special. They are on the bucket list of a lot of divers, definitely of photographers. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. What is important when we dive with them and what are the things we need to watch out for. Then next subject, that now then leads to the research that I've been doing. That is pretty much based on identifying individual Oceanics. Some of you might have seen the seminar that Simon did a few days ago, and he mentioned Shark ID a little bit, so now a lot more specific things about how we do this with the Oceanics. And of course, I'm going to give you some of the results of the research of the last 15, 16 years here in Egypt. And then I'm also going to mention the incident here in 2018. I know that there's a lot of rumors flying around, a lot of rumors on how dangerous Oceanics can be. I personally don't really think so, and I'm obviously to a certain degree a living proof as well. But I want to give you a few facts about these incidents, what the reactions were, what the consequences were, and basically what the results of these measures were that were taken after we had these incidents. Again, for divers, probably quite interesting, and just to give you the facts and not add to the rumor mill that has been running around since then as well. And then finally, as mentioned, I want to talk about conservation. Shark conservation is a huge subject anyway, and in a few days there will be an expert doing another webinar here, which I'm sure Simon will mention later on again as well. Dr. Andy Cornish from the Worldwide Fund for Nature will talk about it. So I'm going to talk more specifically about the situation of the Oceanics, both globally but also what we know here in Egypt and what some of the issues are. Yeah, so this is the general outline. So this is all the things I would like to talk about. So let's get started. Oceanic white tip facts. So what are we looking at here? Let's start with the ID criteria. Again, for those who have never seen one. Oceanic white tip sharks, you see the scientific name there written at the bottom of your screen on the photograph. Carcharinus longimanus, the genus name, the first part of the name identifies this as a requiem or ground shark. So actually, oceanics are very closely related to a lot of the other sharks that divers are looking for and that they are encountering on a regular basis. Gray reef sharks, white tip reef sharks, back tip reef sharks, all the same shark family. Second part of the name, longimanus, now brings us already to some of the ID criteria for this specific shark species. Because what we have in oceanics, and that is very different, they have these really large rounded fins. The first dorsal fin, large and rounded, and the pectoral fins also large with a rounded tip. And it is this pectoral fin that gives them their scientific name. The word longimanus is actually Latin and translates into long hand. So that is a direct reference to these pectoral fins. And actually it's a name that is very often used to refer to this shark to identify the longimanus. Yeah, also in Egypt and in other languages actually, that is very, very common. So this is feature number one, how you can be certain that you have an oceanic around you. The other one is very simply the very conspicuous color markings that they actually have on all their fin tips. And of course, as the name says, most of them are white. Some of them are black as well, but yeah, you will see this picture again later on because it's exactly these conspicuous color markings that make it possible and actually quite easy to individually identify them as well. Yeah, so this is what I'm working with for my research as well. But this is what oceanics look like, okay? So I said it already close. Yeah.
Just before we continue, sorry to interrupt, you wouldn't happen to have a headset with you because lots of people are saying the audio is poor. It was better the other day when we practiced. I don't know, do you have a headset? We could just try it.
I don't have a headset.
Okay, no, never mind. It's lots of people are not hearing it very well. I can hear you okay, but it was better last time, so not sure.
I shifted the computer again a little bit, so is that a little bit better now again?
Go a little bit further away from the computer. I wonder if there's a bit or reduce the volume, your sound volume. Maybe it's feedbacking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better?
No.
Any reactions to this? Is this a little bit better?
I think it's some people who don't have a good internet connection don't hear you that well. Yeah. Just put your volume down or less a little bit, then that's the only thing I can imagine at the moment. Never mind, just continue. It's fine.
I haven't really done much with the volume of my microphone since we tested. I just changed the position of the computer a little bit, so I shifted it back to what we had before. So
I think it's better now. I think it's better now.
Yeah? Okay, so I'll continue a little bit. I hope that, of course, people can hear me. Okay, so as mentioned, this oceanic are closely related to the reef sharks. As the name says, it's a pelagic shark. So you generally do not find it next to shorelines or next to reefs. So next thing I want to show you is actually the distribution map of the shark, which is already again something quite special. Because as you can see, this whole orange area on this world map, this is where you can find oceanic white tip sharks. Yeah, so that is a broad band to the north and the south of the equator actually. And again, in these areas, they are mainly out in the open ocean. So they prefer the shallow parts of the oceans, but above deep water. So that means away from the continental shelves, away from coastlines, away from islands. The further away from the coast you go in most of these ocean basins, the more likely you are to encounter oceanic white tip sharks. And of course, that means that for divers, for people like us, this is generally not a shark that is available in areas where we dive. Open ocean dives are not really something that is generally very likely to be successful. Things in the open ocean are generally widespread, so it's not really something that is safe for us to go to or to meet any of these animals. So there's not many places in the world where you can go to find oceanic white tip sharks. And as it happens, where I am in the moment where I'm working, the Red Sea is one of the best places to do that. There's another area on the other side of the Atlantic. Cat Island in the Bahamas has an oceanic white tip shark population that people can interact with, but it's generally mostly limited to the middle of April until the middle of May. And there's large females that are coming in that are then pretty much disappearing for the rest of the year. So as in terms of regular encounters, the Egyptian Red Sea is considered the top spot to interact with these sharks. Now, what are these guys doing out there in the open ocean? So let's go back to a bit more of a table with the facts. I covered the first two already. So the one that I want to get your attention to now is this part that I just highlighted in red, the food. So of course, typical sharks, they're moving around in their environment to find food. And here we come to a very, very special situation for these oceanics. Oceanics, if you look at this list that is given there in this table, are pretty much interested in everything out there as a food source. Main food sources are bony fish and squid. But other sharks and rays have been found in oceanic stomachs, seabirds, turtles, carrion, mainly mammal carrion, and garbage. So pretty much anything. So when it comes to carrion, as I said, mammals, this is basically an excerpt from a video that I normally show, but again, with the internet connection, videos are very difficult to use on these webinars. So this is a carcass, a whale carcass floating around, and an oceanic white tip shark that as a typical scavenger is using that food source. Yeah, so this is a typical situation to encounter, of course, not only oceanics, but also other scavenging sharks. So one of the special things is the amount of different things that oceanics are interested in. Yeah, they are one of the most opportunistic and general feeders in the shark world. Most other sharks are specialized in some way, either as to what they're interested in, what they're hunting, or when they're hunting. Yeah, so they hunt maybe at night or at dusk or at dawn. They go for squid mainly, or mainly for reef fish. Some of them even some species for crustaceans or for sea urchins. Oceanics will take anything pretty much at any time of day. Any opportunity, whenever it arises, they will take it. And of course, explainable, the open ocean can be a desert when it comes to the availability of marine life. So you cannot really let anything pass by that is a potential food source. So they cannot be picky. Yeah, so this is point number one, very opportunistic in general when it comes to their feeding habits. And the situation as is shown on the picture, when they are around carcasses floating around, then something else shows up, and that is a behavioral trait that makes them successful. Oceanics are known to become aggressive around food sources. So other sharks appearing will be chased away, will be bullied by oceanics so that they get rid of the competition and that they can monopolize their food source. Yeah, so this is the two things that are actually describing a lot of the behaviors of the oceanics that they also show around divers. So let me quickly sum that up. We have a maximum 3-meter shark, predator out there, oceanic predator with an aggressive attitude around food especially. That means they don't have a lot of natural enemies. Not a lot of things will dare to challenge an oceanic white tip shark. And that makes them self-confident. That's characteristic number one that is important for us as well. And then the fact that they investigate everything out there for its potential as a food source. That makes them very curious and very inquisitive. And this is exactly the behaviors that they show around divers. And this is one of the very few sharks that without giving them an incentive, such as chumming or baiting, will approach people and divers very, very closely. So the result is something that you see on this picture here. That's a picture from Egypt, I think from Daedalus Reef, an oceanic right underneath a mooring liveaboard, right next to the divers in the water. This is very, very typical. The boats have interesting smells and vibrations, sounds coming of it, then the activity, the movement of the divers on top of it, and there will be sharks very close to that activity, approaching that activity, whereas most other sharks will shy away from it and will be intimidated by this kind of activity. Yeah, so this, from their biology, explains why these sharks behave so differently around divers as well, and which is also why we have to be aware of them and have to take certain precautions, keep interactions with them safe. Yeah, this is actually the idea. Simon, you're coming on, any question?
Yeah, Elke, so do they have any natural predators, or are there just no predators that are really could scare them, let's say?
Well, let's say larger tiger sharks, of course, other larger sharks around food sources, there will be a limit as to what kind of bullying they can get away with. But adult oceanics in general are considered to have very few enemies. Of course, there's always one predator. I mean, the top predator in the ocean will probably go for anything. That will be the orca. So I don't think anybody is safe from these guys. I don't think that there's any reported attacks, but of course, as a rather tropical warm water species, oceanics are not overlapping too much with orcas. But even false killer whales could be an issue, especially for younger oceanics. Of course, the younger the oceanics are, the more likely they are to be harassed or potentially being preyed upon by other sharks as well. But that's pretty much all there is when it comes to oceanics and their predators.
Okay. Just one note, try to not speak too fast. Some people are saying they can understand it better when you're a little bit slower. Just one feedback.
Okay.
I know.
The challenge? Okay.
Just a little bit. Yeah, anyway.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so from their biological facts, this is now the reason why I actually can explain the next few things that I want to talk about, and that is more specifically how we should be diving with oceanics, if you choose to. Diving with oceanics obviously is really interesting, and as I said, especially for underwater photographers, it makes for awesome photography because you tend to see them quite shallow, and obviously they have no issues coming close to people. And these sharks are basically the rulers out in the blue. So just some general considerations that are not only actually applicable to oceanics, but generally when it comes to shark diving. Yeah, so that is always my main issue to tell people, be respectful. You're entering the environment of a top predator. You're visiting them in their environment, and you need to be aware of what we are dealing with. Yeah, I am a full supporter of people that do not call sharks dangerous. I don't think there is dangerous sharks as such, because none of these sharks has us on the menu or has any beef with us, has any interest in harming us in general. But if things go wrong, if we do something wrong, or if we are not really experienced enough to judge situations correctly, we might get ourselves into dangerous situations with them. Yeah, so be respectful, remember what you're dealing with to avoid that. I think that is really, really important. And of course, it's especially important for us because if an interaction underwater goes wrong, it will go wrong for us and not for the shark. Yeah? They are in their environment, they're superior to us, their maneuverability, their senses in every step of the way. Yeah, so don't lose respect in any interaction with any shark, but especially with sharks like oceanics. And to keep yourself safe, there's one sort of general headline for guidelines on what to do or not to do with them. And that might sound a bit silly, but it is actually very easy to explain. And that is to avoid behaving like potential prey. What does that mean? Potential prey for oceanics, I described their food sources. They're pretty much a health police. So anything out there, especially stuff that is weak, that is injured, in trouble, or sick, that's what they go for. As a successful predator, they go for easy food, and that's obviously exactly that. Animals like this, in trouble, weak, sick, what do? They flop around uncontrolled. So that means they're sending off certain signals because of their movement, which is not regular. Yeah, so that is a starting point for us as well. General idea, you're meeting a self-confident predator, so it starts actually with you at least appearing self-confident as well. How do you do that? You stay calm, no erratic movements. No erratic movement with your fins, no flopping around, fins, arms, anything like this. At least appearing self-confident is the key here. Whatever goes on inside, that might be a different story, okay? And then when it comes to oceanics, it's very helpful to take a vertical position in the water column. Why is that important? It is important because you want to keep your eyes on the sharks. Again, very, very important in interactions with them. The easiest way to keep your eyes on one or even more sharks around you is this vertical position. Because then with simple fin pivoting movements, you can turn and you can turn your head as well and keep track of where the shark or these sharks are going. So you don't have to make a lot of movements. That means you stay calm, you keep your eyes on them, and you don't really create too much movement or anything like this. So that is really, really important for these guys. They're typical sharks, as I said, in a lot of ways, and this is true for the majority of sharks and of predators. If there is an interesting object that they want to approach, they will try to do this from your blind spot. They will try to sneak up on you because something that doesn't see them cannot do anything to them either. So as long as they're coming up from behind you and you're not basically acknowledging their presence, they are much more comfortable to come much closer. And being surprised by an oceanic that comes up right behind you is not a comfortable situation, especially if it happens to you the first time. And staying calm in that situation with that surprise is very, very difficult. Yeah, so to avoid that, make sure that you look around you in a calm and orderly way to avoid this kind of surprise. Okay, so that is point number one. Describing the oceanics and where they feed also obviously leads us to one conclusion. A lot of the food that they're looking for, either carcasses floating around or animals in trouble of some sort, that will be next to the surface or even on the surface. So this is their comfort feeding zone. And that means for you, you want to stay away from this area. Yeah, limit your time on or near the surface with oceanics around. Very important. They are known to be very persistent in closely approaching objects in that area because they're used to finding their feed there. And your situation on the surface, your options to react to them actually is very, very limited. You're stuck in 2 dimensions then, and it's very difficult to react to this kind of stuff and to stay calm throughout it. And this is the main reason actually why in Egypt, very clearly, we are not allowed to swim or snorkel with these sharks. We've had incidents in the past involving snorkelers, and since then there's this very, very clear rule that should be actually adhered to, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable rule as well, especially with these sharks. So limit your time on near the surface. And if you're not so sure if you're that happy with close approaches with oceanics, maybe you haven't really been close to a shark, the deeper you are, the less likely you are to be closely approached. So of course, in the water, you might think originally that you're happy with the shark close to you, but once you have a 2-meter shark pretty much right in front of you, almost in your face, that might not really continue to be comfortable for you. So drop down slowly, or of course the other thing as mentioned, they like the blue. If you go back to the reef, again, you could avoid being very close or being closely approached by these sharks as well. Yeah, so just some tips what to do or not to do when it comes to diving with them. What I just said is really just general things to watch out for. Hopefully, if you dive with oceanics, you will get a much more detailed briefing before you head in the water with them. Yeah, as I said, they're not necessarily dangerous, but again, it is quite easy to get into a dangerous situation with them if you're not aware of the do's and don'ts. So that is an important one for these guys. Because if you jump in the water and there is oceanics close, you better be sure to be prepared for potentially very close encounters. If you look at this shark, the nictitating membrane over the left eye is already up, and that means he is very, very close to almost touching that lens. That is a very, very close encounter. Yeah, so be aware, be careful, and make sure that you're ready for it. Otherwise, stick to what I just said to avoid them. You stay away from the shallow water, or you stay close to the reef. That's very simple as well. But generally, in most situations, and probably a few of the listeners can confirm that, even if the first encounter is a little bit unnerving, generally, because there are gorgeous sharks in these really nice light conditions, people enjoy these close approaches actually very quickly. So this is the general idea. Yes, Simon.
So a couple questions, I think they fit in quite nicely. Pauline is asking, she felt that when she was diving with you, there were 3 female divers, and she felt that the females were more often circled. Would that be because they were maybe the shallowest, or would you say is another reason?
I mean, generally, I haven't really found any preferences of oceanics who they're approaching. And of course, oceanics, like all sharks, have also access to a lot more information when they're around divers. It might very simply be that the people that were approached were just slightly more nervous. So they had increased heart rates, which is something that sharks are known to pick up on. And they find changes in like low frequency sounds interesting. Again, not in an aggressive way, but it makes them more curious. So while people might appear still very calm from outside, if they get nervous, they get an adrenaline rush, the heart rate speeds up, and the shark will, turn towards them to investigate them closer. So something that for us is completely invisible, but the sharks can detect it. That's why it's actually really difficult to judge a lot of shark behaviors, because we don't have access to the same information. They might smell something at this point that interests them. They might hear something that we have absolutely no idea about. So that's why it's always a bit of a guessing game as to why they're doing certain things at a very special moment. But especially when it comes to people that are interacting with sharks, this degree of nervousness and the heart rate, I think, play quite an important role in those interactions.
And another question is basically Gert's asking two questions. Um, how to differentiate when is the time, essentially, when is it aggressive behavior or when is it inquisitive behavior? When should you make a decision to exit the water and end the encounter?
Okay. That, of course, needs to be a bit of a judgment call, and hopefully underneath it all, there is a guide present that has also the experience level to help with that decision. But on principle, the body language of sharks, actually, you can see it from there when their state is changing. A very relaxed shark that's just cruising by will have a relaxed, sort of like normal horizontal body position. The pectoral fins will be relaxed on the side. There will be slow tail movement with not a lot of directional changes or depth changes. Once the excitement sets in, or a shark gets agitated, and that can be simply from a certain smell that they pick up and trying to figure out where this comes from, then you can see the difference. So the tail movement changes, it becomes quicker. The pectoral fins are moving mainly to allow these sharks to maneuver better, to turn quicker. And that's also what they will do close to people. You see it on the shark right here in front of the camera. The right pectoral fin is very far down because he's maneuvering, then he's turning. So this is things then, if this body language changes, it will indicate excitement. And excitement, again, very often with sharks, what we see with the oceanics around the boat, there might be some smell and they think it might be food related. So again, once it comes to changing into feeding mode, you want to stay away from these sharks because we know they become competitive around potential food sources. First of all, it's about giving them space and not approaching them when they start behaving like this. The main thing with anything like this, you decide to leave the water or change where you are to avoid the closeness of the sharks, do it in a calm and orderly fashion. If you want to withdraw, don't turn around and pin away from that shark with maximum speed. That's the worst thing you can do, because again, then you behave like prey for them, you run away from them. So back away, keep your eyes on them, back away to the reef, back away to the ladder of your boat. If you see that the shark changes its behavior, gets excited, turns quickly, changes steps quickly, this is the first indicators of excited sharks or agitated sharks, I would say.
Okay, Elke, some people are saying, and I noticed also the sound just got a bit worse. Let's just try to turn off your video and let's see if that maybe reduces. It's probably the connection that you have to the internet. Let's just see.
Okay. Okay, video is off now. Is that better?
Let's just try it for a little bit and see if it's better.
Okay. All right. Was that the question or any more questions?
No, no. The next questions will come later.
Okay. Cool. So not much then about diving with them. So that rounds it up pretty nicely. So let's then continue. Where am I now? Okay. Yes. So let's move to identifying individual oceanic white-tip sharks then. So I mentioned before, I started here in Egypt as a liveaboard guide in 2004 in April. And as a biologist, had the hope that I would find a biological project that I could do while I'm working on the boats and have so much time out there and also in the water. And then I met these oceanics. So as I mentioned more, identifying them actually turned out to be very, very simple. And for a biologist, the first time you see an animal like this, it screams photo identification. Yeah, again, you see the circles around the fin markings. So you just, if you watch out for it, even one shark, second shark passing, you will see the difference underwater. So these color markings are individually different. All of them are. So I started, as I said, with what I called the Longimanus project, started collecting photographs. That was before I even had my own camera, and started looking into how many different individuals we actually see. Photo identification is actually a beautiful research tool. It's used for quite a few other shark species, whale sharks, great whites. Simon mentioned them in his webinar actually, and has been used for a long time. Surprisingly, in 2004, I couldn't find any reference that anybody else was looking into oceanics with this method. The beauty of the method is obviously it's uninvasive, but it gives you very similar information to a mark and recapture study, which you would normally do by tagging them and then recapturing them to read the information from the tag. So a non-invasive version of a mark and recapture study. So over time, since I had no reference points, I had to obviously figure out what kind of markings were best to use. And I found out that the first dorsal fin is actually the ideal marking to use. First of all, it's large. Second of all, it is actually on a fin that's not moving itself, so you get it from a good angle. And there's another advantage that I will come to a bit later, which I had to find out really over years of studying them. And again, stability is an issue, what I found out over time. The second dorsal and anal fin, like on this individual, actually have a lot of black. This black share on the fins is fading away slowly. The white markings stay stable. So white outlines, white details are staying very stable. So since the dorsal fin normally doesn't really have any black in these sharks, or very few black spots, for them to fade away, that does not really cover the major identifying features of the white markings on the dorsal fin. So this is the main feature that I'm using to identify individual oceanics. So I'll give you a few examples. This is all sharks that appeared actually at the time that we had the incidents. So that is Brother Islands, September, October, November 2018. So you can see the big differences in these different markings, how detailed they are. And again, this is not changing. Yeah, so this is a stable marking. I've had sharks now, the longest one I will show you in a second, that I've seen over 11 years. And from the first sighting to the one 11 years later, there's absolutely no problem recognizing these animals again. Mainly white markings, but if you look at the second row of pictures, the second from your right, obviously there's a massive notch missing. This is a distorted dorsal fin potentially because of an injury. Very difficult to judge what might have caused that, but we have quite a few sharks like this. Of course, this is very distinctive as well. So you can also use patterns like this, but any identification based on injuries, you need to be very careful with, because sharks actually, like a lot of other marine animals, have amazing healing capabilities. So even massive injuries can heal quickly. So star patterns might actually change quite quickly as well, and that will make it difficult to recognize them. But this is just an example of a variety of dorsal fins from our 2018 season, actually. Some of the other results, the database now contains more than 1,000 individual oceanics, and that is based on more than, or just around about 45,000 underwater images. And as far as I'm aware, this is the largest database for this species worldwide. Yeah, because again, in other places, they're not even encountered that regularly. So here in the Red Sea, it is a unique situation where we get these animals on a yearly basis, actually. Yeah, so this is one thing. Then some of the numbers. I'll keep it simple. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of graphs, but just a few things. On the small map on the left side, you see the hotspots for oceanic sightings, which non-surprisingly is our drop-offs. Yeah, these sharks like deep water. So if you go to the drop-offs, these islands or reefs are still very close to their preferred habitat, which is the open ocean above deep water. And the colors that you see there for these three hotspots, Brothers, Elphinstone, and Daedalus, are reflected in the columns of the graph on the right side. So let's first talk about the numbers. Generally, I consider any year where I have more than 100 different individual oceanics that I can identify a good year. So that shows you I started actually off with a good year in 2005. 2004 only includes 3 months, so even the number of close to 80 is actually not bad. And the last 5 years actually across the board were good years with 3-digit numbers of individual oceanics, which, looking at the overall situation of oceanics, is actually a very positive thing to say. Yeah, sort of like steady numbers in terms of individuals. And looking at the color of these columns, as I said, you see the changes where the hotspots for these oceanics actually have been over the years. Yellow column, let's say 2005, does not mean that all the sharks were sighted in Elphinstone, but the majority that year. Yeah, so that means 2006, 2009, majority of oceanics could be seen in Daedalus. And since 2014, and that is until last year, the hotspot for oceanics in Egypt was the two brother islands. Yeah, so this is just a regular thing. What kind of numbers? Now the three red and white columns that you see there, let's talk about those for a second. There the numbers were so low that it was really not worth calling any place a hotspot. Bit of an attempt to explain where the low numbers came from. 2010, 2011, that is probably because in 2010, we had Yemeni fishing boats coming into the Egyptian Red Sea with the sole purpose of catching sharks. And since they approached in the open Red Sea from the south, the majority of sharks they were catching was Oceanic White Tip Sharks. And they made it almost all the way up to Daedalus until they were caught. So this may well have influenced the numbers for these 2 years, 2010 and even 2011. 2013, honestly, I have no idea. It was a normal year. The amount of times we were out there, the weather conditions, Anything seemed perfectly normal. Temperature, which in the Red Sea is fairly steady anyway, some minor differences from year to year, but that's it. Oceanics are not that affected by the temperature range here anyway. They're pretty much like anything that has sea surface temperatures that are, let's say, 21 to 28 degrees. And this is the Egyptian Red Sea all year round. So temperature-wise, there's not really much that could play a role with this one. Yeah, but this is the numbers. This is the rough idea of what I had. How often do we see sharks that are coming? Are they actually hanging around? That's an interesting one. About 3/4 of all the individuals that I've identified over all these 15, 16 years are only seen in 1 year or 1 season. Yeah, and then they go and we don't see them again. And only less than 8% are actually seen across 3 years or more. So a huge majority of sharks is here for 1, maximum 2 years or seasons, and then they either move somewhere else or they just don't come close to these reefs anymore. There's different options, of course, why we don't see them anymore. It also means that the resighting rates are quite low. That has been a bit of a change which might have influenced the incidence. I'll mention that a bit later. Yeah, but generally 80%, 75, 80% of the sharks we see every year are new ones. And quite actually reassuringly, we see a lot of young sharks. So there's a lot of recruitment of new and young sharks in this population, which is, as I said, a good sign. They must be breeding here somewhere, and apparently at least reasonably successfully, because we have these steady numbers of new sharks coming in every year. The longest sighting records that I have are for 2 females. One of them was sighted over 10 years, and the other one actually sighted over 11 years in total, yeah, which is quite a long period of time. A few more details on what sighting records can look like. The one on the left side for female number 1609 is a very typical one because she's been cruising all the hotspots, yeah, over 3 years. And also what happens sometimes starting at one hotspot and changing to another one in the same year. So September 2017, showed up at the Brothers. A month later, she was in Elphinstone, which is where she returned to in 2018. And then finally last year, I met her in Daedalus Reef. Yeah, so that is very typical. Now look at the one on the left side, and this is the one with the longest sighting records. 11 years of sightings, not many, not every year, but pretty much steadily. The longest gap was obviously until last year when she hasn't been seen for 5 years. But look at the areas where she is. This is basically, probably in the States you would say a southern gal. So St. John's is her favorite hangout. Only once she ventured up north, not really for oceanics, if you see where she ended up, Fury Shoal area. So for the most part of our oceanic population, that is still very far south actually. And also quite special, her sightings in the south are very often outside the season. Season is September through to November, December. So 3 of her 5 sightings were actually in April, May, which is typical for the south, but not typical for the majority of the oceanics here. So she is quite special. She is also one of the largest oceanics that I have ever encountered. And she was already large in 2009 when I saw her first. And you can tell that you don't actually have to take measurements to estimate how big an oceanic is, because you can see it from the proportions. I will show you. This is the one that I'm talking about. Yeah, this is the female number 917 from the south. This is a picture of her from last year, from May. Yeah, so you can see her proportions. You might not have paid attention to this, but most of the other shark pictures that I've showed you so far show the typical either sub-adult or young adult oceanics. I'll show you another picture to show you the difference. This is what they look like. Now look at the girth. I mean, they're generally very, very slender, but if you look at the picture on the top, the biggest girth in this animal is somewhere behind the pectoral fin, maybe just before the dorsal fin. Yeah, this is typical proportion. If you look at the bottom picture of this large female, her biggest girth is actually around the gill area. Yeah, so it's a completely different proportion as a silhouette. The first animal of this proportion that I saw from a distance, I wasn't even sure it was an oceanic because the outline is so different. And that is actually really interesting for me because among all these like more than 1,000 individual sharks that I have identified, either because I saw them myself or because I've seen pictures of them, there's less than 20 of her proportions. And the majority of those I've seen only once and then never again. Yeah, so these guys definitely are not hanging around. It was mainly females, but also some large males that have the same proportion. So it's not really clear what that means. Does that just mean she is really old and only old sharks get the chance to grow into these proportions? Sharks grow all their lives. Once they reach sexual maturity, they grow in very small increments, but they're quite long-lived. The maximum life expectancy for an oceanic is probably around about the 35 to 40 year mark. Although there is still a lot of discussions about that, it's actually quite tricky to age sharks. So she matures, let's say, at an age of maybe 7, 8, 9 years, but then she keeps growing. So maybe she is really close to her maximum lifespan, 30, 35 years old. That we don't see many of them could mean a few things. Maybe they just take on a different lifestyle, the majority of them, once they mature and leave. Or we might also here have issues with overfishing, and the sharks don't get the opportunity anymore to grow to this maximum length. This is actually a general pattern in the rest of the oceanic population around the world, that the median sizes and weights of these sharks get smaller and smaller. And that is also a case for a lot of other shark populations, shark species, where formerly reported maximum sizes cannot be found anymore for a few decades already. And that, in a lot of cases, is unfortunately a sign of overfishing them. I find these animals, especially the big ones, really fascinating. They're amazing. She's close to 3 meters long, I would say. Yeah, I always really like seeing her again. Obviously, last year in May, I was thrilled to recognize her again. And Simon is coming on again.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions. By the way, guys, I will put the questions a bit together. So if your specific question disappears from the Q&A, that just means I've wrote it down and I will combine it with some others. I'm going to try to get Elke to answer all questions as we go along. There were some interesting questions around the assumed migrations. You said the vast majority of sharks don't seem to come back. So where do you think they go? And have there ever been sightings in other regions of the ones that you've identified?
Well, this is difficult to judge. I mean, generally, this part of the Red Sea, North and Central Red Sea, seems to be the preferred area for the oceanics in terms of the temperature as well. We don't know much of what's going on the other side in Saudi Arabia, because until now, the diving industry there is very underdeveloped. I mean, I believe they're changing that in the moment, but for now, there's really not much information coming from the other side. And then if we're going further south, which would of course be the next option then, so southern part of Saudi Arabia, other side around about the Jeddah area, where there is a lot more activity in terms of both research and diving. There's basically no oceanic white tip shark sightings, and oceanics are also not showing up on the local fish market. So that would say they're down south, Saudi Arabia, not much oceanics. And of course, in Sudan, there's quite a well-developed diving industry. There's regular dive safaris out there diving liveaboards. But again, there I had one case, and that was last year, where in February 2019, one of the males that were at the Brothers here in Egypt in 2018 had rocked up at a dive site in Sudan. This is the only confirmed sighting of one of the sharks here from Egypt outside Egypt, and that is obviously Red Sea. So that's the next step along from Egypt where this shark was sighted. Otherwise, also in Sudan, very, very rare sightings of oceanics altogether. One idea is really that the oceanics are sort of staying in the North and Central Red Sea, and that mainly the young adults, before they or just after reaching sexual maturity, are so interactive with divers and dive boats in these areas, and the others are simply staying where they're mainly staying, which is out in the open, maybe hanging out in the shipping lanes, waiting for food there, but that they're not really migrating very far, maybe not even outside the Red Sea. And a reason for this could be that the southern area of the Red Sea, both actually on the Saudi Arabian side and in Sudan, and there is behavioral and some research evidence, this is taken up by silky sharks. There's a lot more silky sharks down there. There's a lot of juvenile silky sharks down there. So this is maybe a way for these two species that would otherwise compete pretty much across their range to stay away from each other, to not compete with each other, so that the northern central territory is for the oceanics, and then further south on both sides, Saudi Arabia and Sudan, you have the silky sharks. So this is the indication. But of course, final check for this one would be either tagging sharks to see how far they're exactly going, or even genetic studies. And none of this has happened here in the Red Sea yet. So that is just a speculation. based on obviously some information, but this is not really proper scientific fact.
Elke, some more questions by the viewers were around tagging. So has there been any tagging, or will there be, or why is there no tagging? So GPS tags or something like that.
Yeah, for those that have been on the boat with me, they will already know that is a constant source of actually frustration. There have been organizations that tried to arrange for tagging, but unfortunately this has been shut down. Every attempt has been shut down by the government here, I think by the military. There's some very distinct sort of regulations and rules here when it comes to satellite equipment. The use of drones is not allowed. Officially, nobody's allowed to even own a satellite phone here in Egypt. So it is apparently pretty much impossible to get permits to import tags like this, because again, highly migratory species, you cannot really work with acoustic tags because they might never come back into the range of underwater receivers, which you would have to use to follow them. So you need satellite equipment, satellite tracking equipment, which is available, but it's very expensive as well. So taking the risk of buying this stuff and then basically trying to smuggle it into the country would be very, very tricky. And since in Saudi Arabia it would be possible, they tag sharks there, but they don't have oceanics. So the only place to really tag oceanics would be here from Egypt. And exactly here, this is where we're not allowed to do it, which again is a source of constant frustration for quite a few years, because of course this would be the best option to close the gaps in the information that we can collect with the methods that we have.
Okay, there are more questions, but I'll summarize some towards the end for like biological questions that we didn't get to yet. But maybe one last question while we're in this area. Do you have or do you know of general population data of oceanic whitetips worldwide? Do we know? And if yes, what is the developments that we have there?
This is something that I will touch upon actually when it comes to conservation, what we know about the population trends. But what I can tell you, there is no estimates of the size of global oceanic whitetip shark populations. There is ideas about how much they declined. This comes from fisheries data, which, as I said, I will get to in a bit more detail, because that's exactly why shark conservation in terms of, or oceanic conservation is so important to talk about. But there is no estimates for population size. And that is actually true for most sharks, to be honest. That's maybe just something that I can throw in at this point, since we're talking about one research method here. Sharks are very, very difficult to study. Yeah, they're constantly submerged, they're highly mobile, and a lot of them, including the oceanics, are highly migratory. And that makes it very, very difficult to get numbers of them, because how do you count animals like this? And of course, an additional problem that we have nowadays is we have no baseline data. We don't even know what population numbers we might have started with before industrial fishing started, wherever you place that, I don't know, middle of the 50s, middle of the 60s at the latest, I guess, would be the cutoff point, and then we started having industrial fishing. So because of this, there is no numbers. There's estimates and there's trends, but there is no numbers. Nobody can tell you how many oceanics we think are swimming around in the global oceans. That's not available.
So I'll come with other questions later. I just wanted to tell everybody, guys, we're getting close to the 1 hour that is planned. Both Elke and myself have time, so we will just continue. For those who only have that 1 hour, as mentioned before, the video will be uploaded probably tomorrow on Facebook and YouTube, and Elke will share it as well. Also, I will be sending out an email to everybody with a couple of the information, such as where you can access the database, where you can send photos to. So if you want to share photos with Elke, because she can add them even in the past. So I will send an email with all interesting links. So if you do have to leave, we totally understand. But I think lots of people are anyway interested to hear more. So we're just going to continue. I just wanted to make that note before we reach actually the full hour. And you can always wait for that email that I'm going to send out, and you will have Elke's email and my email if you have any further questions. Back to Elke.
Okay, so that was actually what I wanted to say about research anyway. So let's just make a short sort of like excursion into the incident. So maybe this is good that we hit this just before we get to the full hour. Okay, so what actually happened? We had incidents with oceanics at the Brothers in 2018. So, and as you saw in the data, the two brother islands were the primary oceanic hotspots since 2014. So what happened, starting in June, we had incidents, and actually incidents involving divers now, of course, since there is no snorkeling or swimming, so we're talking incidents with divers. It started off in the beginning of June with a diver being bitten on the upper thigh, and then we actually had 4 incidents in November, from the beginning until the middle end of November. 4 cases, again, one involving lacerations to an upper thigh, one was a severe bite to the lower leg, basically resulting in the loss of the calf muscle. And then we had 2 cases where BCDs were damaged because of oceanics biting them. So of course, this was a cluster of incidents. It's not the first ever time that an oceanic bit divers equipment. We had oceanics nibbling on fins before. I'm aware of one case where BCD was damaged as well, but this cluster of incidents was very, very unusual and obviously quite worrying as well. And also the fact that at least 3 different sharks were involved in these incidents. Now, I can personally vouch for 2 different individuals being involved. The third one, I have to make a little bit of a question mark behind, because I cannot actually identify the individual from the video of the incident. So I had to rely on the statement of a guide that gave me a picture saying he saw the incident and he's 100% sure that this is the shark. So if I take this as correct information, I can say there was 3 different sharks. So it's not 1 shark, it's 3 sharks, so that's a bit more of a general change in behavior. I found it quite unusual as well. All these 3 sharks were known to me. One of them for more than a year, actually, from the brothers. The others had shown up months before the incidents and were seen a few weeks after the incidents, actually, as well, as long as that was possible. So what was the reaction? A decision was made to close both brother islands for diving. That was in the beginning of December. That was, I think, 10 days after the last incident that was recorded and reported. And throughout the closure period, they introduced mandatory training sessions or training seminars for both the boat crews and captains and the dive guides. Now, the dive guide training was something that I did, and the boat and captain's training was done by marine biologists and by basically people that were involved in ecological management here in Egypt. Main reason for the closure, to be perfectly honest, was to hit a bit of a reset button, because there was a general consensus that the presence and the activities, the behavior of the liveaboards and the divers were at least partially responsible for the change in behavior. Let me clarify this a little bit. We had a bit of a change in how safari boats are operating over the last few years, let's say over the last 10 years. Originally, there was like 1 or 2 days when safari boats would leave the marinas and start their safaris. For the last years, we have staggered departures of liveaboards from different ports every single day of the week, depending on flight schedules and which nationalities boats are mainly working with. So that means these staggered departures mean that also dive sites are now basically constantly busy. Whereas before there was like 2, 3, maybe 4 days, and then there would be 2, 3, 4 days where there was nothing much going on. So constant presence of quite a lot of divers, especially in the main season, which happens to be also the main season for the oceanics, October, November time. So brothers as well, special situations, especially small brother, quite small islands. So a lot of the dives are finishing underneath the boats. And since the oceanics are one of the attractions to go there, there was basically people hanging underneath the boats to dive with the oceanics the whole day, pretty much every day. And of course, the presence of the liveaboards, unfortunately, also offers a bit of a reward system for these sharks to hang around. Some of it is sort of completely coincidental. Kitchen drains that are leading out. This is the construction of the boats. Some of it has changed now, not all of it yet. Some of it, unfortunately, was on purpose. People still sort of chumming and feeding so that sharks are hanging around so their divers can see them. And then we come to really illegal behavior as well. Fishing that's going on there, especially in the night for the mooring liveaboards. It's very difficult to get fishing out of Egyptian crew members. A lot of them come from fishing backgrounds. But of course, in the marine parks with oceanics around, that pretty much constitutes feeding sharks as well. Yeah, a lot of the fish that they're trying to fish for, the oceanics are getting first. And again, it's a reward system, so they keep hanging around. And one other issue, how the organic waste is being dealt with. We're generally allowed to dispose of it at sea, but it needs to be far away from reefs, ideally when we're traveling in open water, or if we're at reefs for a longer period of time, take it out by Zodiac, drive away, I think at least 5 nautical miles or even more, and then throw it in the open ocean so that it doesn't clog corals or cover corals in any shape or form. But nobody really controls how far boat crews are taking out the organic waste. So again, potential chance for rewarding sharks to hang around. So I think this is sort of like the breeding ground for these potential incidents. Sharks hanging around, being rewarded for hanging around diving boats and divers, and becoming so familiar and comfortable with them that these close interactions eventually took a wrong turn. Sometimes because of divers doing the wrong thing. In 2 cases of these incidents, divers turned around, swam away from that shark, basically running away from it without even looking back, and were then grabbed. Both of them minor lacerations. At the moment that the shark realized that they grabbed part of the body, they let go and they left, but still potentially triggered by sort of wrong behavior of the divers. So again, this is the reason for the training seminars. And then, of course, eventually the brothers opened again. That was in mid-March 2019, hoping that the sharks would use that time without attraction points of the liveaboards to do what they're supposed to do, to go out into the open ocean, and then maybe some of them to return October, November in the season. Yeah, this was the idea. There were new rules then, and the major new rule actually that I think was also the most important one, and the one that hopefully now most people are following, that there's no more mooring overnight at the brothers. So while we all love the brothers and would like to spend as much time there as possible, but we're not allowed to dive there for more than a day, then we have to leave. And again, explainable, organic waste is dealt with in the night, and also the illegal fishing was happening at night. So to basically make it impossible for these things to happen still and to create new sort of like danger points, this was taken out of the equation. And looking at the season 2019, it worked. We had no incidents at the brothers. There was not a lot of oceanics throughout most of the year, which to a certain degree for the divers is a shame, but in terms of their natural sort of like migration and appearances, that is actually quite good because it's back to normal, I would say. And then the ones that appeared, October, November, there was quite calm interactions, curiosity, but pretty much back to the typical stuff without too much tricky stuff going on. Now, there might be a question, if we do this to the brothers, have we just shifted the problem to other places now like Daedalus? And the numbers might look a little bit like this, because hotspot 2019 with the new rules for the brothers was Daedalus. Daedalus, the situation is a little bit different though. Daedalus is a much bigger reef, so a lot less dives are actually ending underneath the boat. A lot of dives are finishing somewhere else. So hanging underneath the boat with oceanics is nowhere near as common in Daedalus as it was at the brothers. And also very often in Daedalus, especially over the last few years, we had very strong currents underneath these boats as well. So strong current means there's nobody hanging there with oceanics as well, even if oceanics are there, but then we cannot stay there. So that minimizes, again, the options for the same problems that we had at the brothers. And of course, I don't really have any way of checking what's going on in the moment. In the moment, there shouldn't be many oceanics out there anyway. And obviously, I hope that by October, we're going to be able to go out there again and at least have part of an oceanic season. And it will be interesting to see what's going on out there without any liveaboards being out there for such an extended period of time. So I'll be quite curious, not only for the oceanics, but obviously what it has done to the rest of the marine life out there as well. Yeah, but this is just basically a short summary about these incidents, what was done after they occurred, why it was done, and some of the results or some of the effects that it had that we can report on until now. Yeah, so this is the idea there.
Can I ask a couple of questions there, maybe? So one of the questions was that Daria experienced that there were some shark education programs, and there was chumming used in the Red Sea, BDE in the BDE route, and she was wondering if that might have had an influence on the overall 2018 peak in incidents.
There's been rumors for a long time, and then some videos appeared sort of in hindsight, but obviously these videos are not dated, and it's very difficult to follow up on it. It seemed to have been one sort of like educational program where they seem to try to teach people how to make a shark attack you, which I think is an absurd thing to do, but that's what it looked like on the video. But it was very difficult actually to follow up who this actually was and when that was. There was attempts made to localize who the person was or where this program came from, to at least contact them and to make it clear that this is illegal in Egypt, and that if they don't basically assure the officials that they would stick to the rules of not chumming and not baiting, that they would be banned from the Red Sea. But of course, for this, you first need to have proof that somebody did something. This cannot really work on a guess or on a speculation. And of course, again, with videos, they can always go back and say, this is from years ago, and that is a bit of a tricky thing. And recognizing divers underwater with their equipment is also a bit difficult, so there, to get to the facts. But yeah, I've seen these videos, I've seen potentially some of them, I don't know all of them, but there was videos out there that looked as if chumming was being used to make sure that divers have close encounters with oceanics, yes.
And I think there is a lot of similar questions where people are wondering what's going to happen now, or what do you think is going to happen with this season basically being closed due to COVID-19. So what do you think is going to happen? And I want to add one more question that I heard that I read somewhere, is where people were saying when it reopened in 2019, the oceanics were back to normal, but other shark species were less. So maybe these two questions you could touch as well.
I wouldn't really say other species were less. For example, in 2019, I saw more tiger sharks in 1 year, even just glimpses of them that I'd seen ever before. And of course, if I say I saw tiger sharks, that might have a lot more influence on the presence of other sharks than the closure of the brothers for some time, because obviously tiger sharks are potential predators for other sharks. So if they show up in different places, that will influence other sharks showing up or not. Other than that, I cannot say that I saw less species. We've had silkies last year in 2019 after reopening. We've had threshers as usual. Gray reef sharks, I would say there's a decline generally over the last few years. So this is not something that's specific for 2019. I think this is an ongoing thing that I tend to see less and less gray reef sharks. But otherwise, the hammerheads were in Daedalus pretty much as usual, and same numbers in the small school that we use as a reference point. So I wouldn't generally say that there was less species. There was whale shark sightings, there was manta sightings. So as like across the board from the amount of different species that we tend to see here, not everywhere, not all the time, but over the season, I would think it wasn't an atypical season after the brothers reopened again, to be perfectly honest. So. Yeah.
And what do you think is going to happen after COVID-19? What do you think? Theory.
Difficult to judge. I mean, for the oceanics, I don't think it will influence them a lot. As I said, in the moment, there shouldn't really be many oceanics around anyway. We're expecting them normally to come in, some of them maybe by August to September, but generally the majority comes in September, October. So for them, it might not even be that noticeable that there's no liveaboards or divers out there. For the rest of them, I would say it's good. Generally, I'm hoping that this will be a bit of a recovery time, because obviously generally the amount of divers and the constant presence of divers for a lot of the marine life is rather a disturbance. So whoever's lucky enough to get out there first might actually have some nice surprises of maybe thresher sharks, shallower than usual, maybe hammerheads being a lot more curious because they haven't seen divers for a long period of time. It all depends on when that happens. I'm hoping it's a bit of a recovery period, but of course I'm also hoping that the lack of liveaboards out there does not mean that fishing boats are venturing out there to make a buck. That is always a bit of a worry here. Fishing out there is illegal, but to a certain degree, the liveaboards are offering a bit of an incentive for fishermen to really stay away. So for some dive sites, especially that are more accessible, there is a bit of a danger that fishermen are going to frequent them more than they usually dare to with divers around. So it could go either way, I would say.
Apparently, there's research in Guadeloupe, where the great whites are, that the fact that there are dive boats there for half a year reduces the presence of fishing boats, because the chances are very high that they will be reported on. So there is also positives about dive boats being around, as you just mentioned. It can keep others away. Renata asked an interesting question. So you also think that there might be more fishermen coming in, but she's asking about smugglers coming into the Red Sea. Do we expect there an increase due to no liveaboards? Maybe there's more smuggling going on. I'm not quite sure from where to where, but...
Well, I mean, there is a lot of I would say there's a lot of smuggling, but I think quite a few fishing boats are used for smuggling as well, not purely smuggling. Not that I'm an expert on, you know, the smuggling scene here in Egypt, but as far as I'm aware, there has been obviously incidents of drug smuggling going on. If that's now from wherever that's coming, if this is across to the other side, Saudi Arabia, if that involves Yemen, which is obviously an extremely poor country. The exact pathways of whatever might be smuggled, I'm not aware of. And I'm not really sure that the presence of liveaboards has so much of an influence on that one, because they're not going to be coming into, they're not having to do anything with dive sites as such. As I said, without being an expert on smuggling, I would say there's a likelihood for an increase, but that is more also out of economic demand. Of course, we're living in a country where there's no social net, so Egyptians will try anything now to make money, because again, this is critical. COVID-19, there's no tourists, so for millions of people, that means there is no income. So just out of desperation, they might try to smuggle things just, you know, to make money. But that is just a general economic consideration that I'm sure is the same in other countries. I don't really know how this is related otherwise to the presence of dive boats or not, to be honest.
Okay, I'll let you continue then.
All right, final subject then, and again, a bit of a warning. Shark conservation in general is a rather depressing subject. So oceanic white-tip shark conservation, very much so, unfortunately. So I'm just going to talk you through some of the facts that are known. I already mentioned that there's a lot of issues in getting numbers, but there is a few things that we know. And again, in the case of the oceanic, they're rather negative, or as I said, even depressing. So what's the situation globally? Well, we have to deal with the fact that we have estimated declines of between 80 to 95% across the distribution range of oceanic white-tip sharks. One exception might be the North Atlantic. There's also not a lot of numbers from the Indian Ocean, although the area around the Maldives falls exactly into that same percentage as well, probably around about 90% there. So there is a very good chance that we only have between 5 and 20% left of what we started with when it comes to oceanics. And this is a shark species, or this is a predatorial species, that by the end of the 60s might well have been the most abundant, not only shark, but the most abundant large animal on the planet. Large animal in this case being defined as animals that weigh more than 45 kilos or 100 pounds. So this is from a book in the end of the 60s. That is an honest estimate because of the abundance of oceanic white-tips around the world. So we might have lost 5 to 20% of that as we speak. And again, of course, most of the numbers, most of the assessments are from a few years ago already. What's the main threats to these oceanics? That's pretty simple. Incidental bycatch is a huge issue, or also very easy to explain. Looking at where these oceanics are, yeah, tropical warm seas, a lot of the hotspots for fishing, especially fish like tuna, that is massively overlapping with a range of oceanics. So different basically fishing techniques. Long lining is probably the biggest culprit there, but also perseining, even gill nets. And of course, oceanics are one of the easiest sharks to catch, very close to the surface, cruising along in these areas where there's high productivity and where people are looking for stuff like tuna. So that's one issue. And then, of course, we have the problem that oceanics have these massive fins for their size. So even if they're incidentally bicaught, the fishermen know that there's a lot of money to be made out of the fins. So they're not releasing them, but they keep them. So this is called opportunistic utilization. And then, of course, because of the high value of the fins, they're also directly targeted by certain fishermen, which is mostly illegal, but of course it still happens. Anything that has large profit margins will happen. Yeah, that is very, very generally true for everywhere. So these are the major threats, and this is why these declines are happening. And of course, this also means most of these estimates are coming from stock assessments and from fisheries data. And of course, there is places where this kind of data is not available, or where it's very unreliable. So that's why this is estimated declines. But there's very recent, actually, assessment 2019, 2020, very recent publications that deal specifically with the situation of oceanic white-tip sharks. And this is also the reason why we've had a lot of changes in regulations that are also dealing with oceanics. Oceanics were the first commercially interesting shark species that made it on the so-called CITES Appendix 2. CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. And this is one of the conventions actually that pretty much all the countries in the world have signed. So all the red countries, which is pretty much all of them, have signed this convention, and they're bound by the regulations that are coming out of it. The few countries that haven't, I actually had to look some of them up, but up there, sort of like Asia, Turkmenistan is one of them. In Africa, South Sudan, West Sahara, Timor-Leste, I think hasn't signed it, but that is pretty much it. Everybody else has signed it and is bound to these regulations, which is of course a very good thing for conventions like this. And of course, sharks like oceanics, highly migratory, living all around the world and especially in open water, need international regulations. National rules and regulations can only take you that far with animals like this. Yeah, so that was an important one. Appendix 2 means that any trade needs to be backed up by special permits, which you can only get if you can prove that you can catch them sustainably. In a species that is potentially down to 20% of what it used to be, or even less, that should be out of the question to start with. But since then, with the trends that have become clearer and clearer since 2013, they have been listed now, as you see this list, as threatened under the United States Endangered Species Act. They've been fairly recently, 1.5 years ago, changed in their IUCN status from vulnerable to critically endangered. And also as of a few months ago, they're listed on CMS Appendix 1. CMS is the Convention on Migratory Species. That, of course, again, for animals like oceanics is a very crucial one because it, again, touches on the subject that national regulations are not enough. And in this case, Appendix 1 is complete protection. No catching, no killing, because this is leading them on the path of extinction. This is the species on Appendix 1. The Convention on Migratory Species, though, has one major downfall, and that is another map. And in this case here, only the blue countries have signed it. And if you look at all the countries that are green, this is major players in terms of fisheries around the world. The whole of North America, Canada, North America, Mexico have not signed. The Russian Federation, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, all of Indonesia, none of them have signed this convention. So they're not bound by these regulations even. Yeah, so this is a big issue. So how can we solve that internationally before I come to the Egyptian situation? Incidental bycatch is something that will be difficult to stop, but looking at where these sharks are, some changes in the equipment might help. And again, more research is actually asked to do that. Releasing oceanics. Oceanics are known to have actually higher survival rates than a lot of other sharks. Why exactly is a bit unclear. But of course, if you retain them because you want to sell the fins, that doesn't really help anybody. And again, so that goes back to there is serious regulations in place by most regional marine fisheries operations that it's forbidden, completely forbidden and prohibited to retain oceanics that are incidentally caught and of course to target them directly. But then we come to the problem about observers on board or electronic devices that supervise the closely monitoring of all these regulations. Regulations are always only a first step, but they need to be policed and they need to be controlled. And of course, again, in international fisheries, that is a massive undertaking. And again, other problems, and that is the same in Egypt. To properly protect a species, you need to know basic biological facts. And again, for any species, that starts with where and when are they breeding? Where are the nursery grounds? And for oceanics, to be honest, one of the species, one of many species where we have no idea about this one. Just recently, they came across a lot of very young, potentially almost newborn oceanics in the Caribbean, around Cuba and Haiti. So now they're suspecting that a nursery ground might be close to there. So there's more investigations going into this, because of course, this is the first thing that you need to protect from fishing. There's a few populations of oceanics where they do not find juvenile animals. They find sub-adults and adults. So apparently there's no recruitments of new sharks into these populations. So all of this does not really bite very well for their recovery as well. Oceanics are not the least reproductively active sharks, or they don't have the lowest reproductive potential, but they still mature quite late, have fairly small litter sizes, and can have a gap of up to 2 years between litters. So of course, reproductive potential typically for sharks is still not extremely high. Yeah, so this is a bit of an issue. Now the Egyptian situation, where are we here? We have regulations, not specifically for oceanics, but for sharks in general. Yeah, Red Sea is a no-take zone for sharks, or should be. This is the shark on the picture actually that was officially caught. That was in 2010 after a bout of shark attacks in Sharm. Of course, they caught a shark that had nothing to do with any of the attacks that occurred there, but yeah, that is a slightly different subject. So this is just to show you that shark fishing also in Egypt still happens. Yeah, it shouldn't, but it does. And of course, one major issue here in Egypt when it comes to judging how high fishing pressures are is the structure of the fishing industry. The Red Sea is basically a coral sea. So not a lot of nutrients, it's not a very productive sea when it comes to the interest for fishing fleets, which is good to a certain degree. But of course that also means fish stocks and populations of predators are much smaller as well. It's not as rich. And of course that also makes them more vulnerable to overfishing. If there's not much there anyway, there is issues with that. And we don't know. Fish stocks are not really well researched here. Shark fishing, definitely in Egypt, is not, it's illegal, so nobody will report it anyway. And the fishery is very decentralized, very sort of unorganized, if you like. A lot of it is artisanal fishery. So to really know how high the pressures are is extremely difficult and challenging. There was research on the other side in Saudi Arabia, looking at the fish market in Jeddah on a regular basis for 2 years to basically document the sharks that were sold there. No oceanics there, but just from the amount of sharks and the kind of species that came up there, they actually came up with the result that even in this eastern part of the southern Red Sea, shark fishing is already unsustainable. Here in Egypt, we don't, on the Egyptian side of the Red Sea, we don't have big fish markets. Anything that's being caught goes into villages or is directly sold to hotels or restaurants. So it's very, very difficult to find somewhere to actually see what is being caught. So that is an issue. And of course, I mentioned it, illegal fishing coming from liveaboards is an issue. We have oceanics around the marine park swimming around with a variety of hooks over time. And again, in the normal season with liveaboards there, we don't see fishing boats out there. The only boats that are out there on a regular basis are liveaboards. So this is fishing that happens from liveaboards, either because of guests that are allowed to do that or because of crew members that are doing it. This is basically the only options. This shark, for example, it looks really, really bad, and I was quite worried seeing that. I saw the shark again 6 months later, the hook was gone, so they are very resilient, and a lot of them actually get rid of hooks, even like this, big hooks in uncomfortable places. Others have distorted jaws, basically where hooks were ripped out over time because there's lines attached to them, there's resistance, dragging on, they can swim around with them for months. So obviously fishing is an issue and it's dangerous for sharks, potentially fatal. And of course also other stuff can be very dangerous for sharks, and something from Egypt quite famous from 2018. This shark, you might have seen him, actually her, a female on the internet. What she has deeply embedded in her neck there and damaging at least 2 of her 5 gill slits on either side is diving equipment. That's an octopus holder. Now, one of these rubber octopus holder, you see it on the left side, on her, basically her belly side, you see the loop where you would normally put your mouthpiece through. So this is something that divers carry around the neck. They put the mouthpiece through as an octopus holder. How she ended up with it, that's a very good question. But yeah, frighteningly, to get to this really bad stage of deeply biting into her neck and really damaging her there, it took only 3 months. I saw her, this is a picture from, the picture on the left is from October 2018. I saw her in July without a sign of this octopus holder. And of course, she swam off November 2018 and we thought we would not see her again. She reappeared in 2019. And miraculously, crew members from a liveaboard here in Egypt actually managed to catch her simply by lassoing her in without even hooks or bait or anything like that. Well, there was a bit of bait involved, but no hooking involved, and managed to take it off her. So since she survived with this basically being this deeply embedded, hopefully her chances for survival now without this around her are very, very good. As I said, they have amazing healing capabilities. We saw it in another shark that was in a similar fix than she was, again, 2018. And this shark had a plastic band deeply embedded in a similar area where she had it. And this was cut off in November 2018. And this picture is from May 2019. So 6 months after this plastic band was taken off him, this is what he looks like. So of course the scarring around the gill and neck area will remain, but he survived and is likely to continue surviving if he survived this for 6 months already. So they can recover if they're taken care of. But of course, this is not an invitation for any sort of disposal or taking care of your own equipment as well. So again, we have conservation issues here, but again, to sort of quantify them is extremely, extremely complicated. Right. Simon, questions? Because I'm pretty much at the end of it now anyway.
Okay, could just go a couple slides back. Somebody asked what was the second dead shark. It looked indeed different. I couldn't tell what the other shark
That
was.
That was a mako shark.
Mako. Okay, Mako. Well, okay, so I'm going to ask you now some groups of questions that appeared from the different people. Maybe you can put your video back on. It has been a lot better, to be honest, but I mean, people are here to see you as well. So let's just start with the biology. Start from the beginning. There were some questions about the birth. One is, how do we know that they only have a litter of 6? And do we know anything about in vitro cannibalization? So when they eat each other in the belly. Also, where do they give birth? Do we know anything about that? Yeah, those are some of the questions around young sharks.
Okay, so generally, I mean, oceanics belong to obviously a family of sharks, the ground sharks, where most of them, bar I think 1 or 2, give birth to live young. And none of these sharks, this involves intrauterine cannibalism. So this is a very rare, actually, feature. I think, yeah, Simon, you mentioned anyway in your last presentation or last webinar. Sand tigers, for example, ragged-toothed gray nurse sharks, they do that. But in the ground sharks, that is not something that is actually found. A lot of the reproductive information about sharks comes from fisheries, because there's a lot of researchers that are actually using the incidental bycatch to actually open up these sharks, and then they come up with information. That's also how they get, let's say, access to the vertebra to check their ages, size at maturity. So what were the smallest ones where they find embryos in, or where they just check the whole reproductive tract to find what state they are in. So a lot of the reproductive information obviously does not come from direct observation. Yeah, this is very tricky in sharks, and especially in oceanic sharks. So a lot of that comes from research that is conducted because of sharks that were caught. Normally, they don't catch them for research, which would be slightly counterproductive anyway, but they're using sharks that have been caught anyway and died as bycatch. And this is where a lot of this information comes from. So how many pups do you find in pregnant females that were caught? Yeah, again, Simon mentioned in his last webinar, the only information about the reproduction of whale sharks comes from one harpoon female of Taiwan from 1995. Now, of course, in sharks like oceanics that are being frequently caught, there is more information available. So there you have from the different ocean basins, from the Indian Ocean, from the Pacific, from the Atlantic, you have the information, age and size at maturity, litter sizes, and then also actually guessing, estimating what is the gap between the reproductive cycles. So this is where this information comes from. So in summary, for the oceanics, they mature, depending on male female, at the age of between 7 to 9 years of age. They generally have a size of between 1.70 m to 1.80 m when that happens. Litter sizes, the gestation periods looks as if it differs from 10 to 12 months, depending on where you are and which ocean. They start with very small litter sizes, maybe only 1 or 2. Average litter size seems to be 6 to 8, and absolute maximum so far is like 14, 15. And like in other ground sharks, the size of the litter is correlated with the size, meaning the age of the female. And of course, that means in overfished populations where they don't reach a full age or length, that means that they might actually die before they ever come to the maximum litter size. So litter sizes might be lower than they could be in non-overfished species. So this is the general biological information that we have on the reproduction of oceanics. But as I mentioned before, even basic stuff, where are the nursery grounds? Where and when are they mating? Where and when are they giving birth is unknown. There is indications that there's not maybe one breeding season a year, maybe 2. So maybe there's like 2 peaks of pregnancies and of matings. Indications of things like this is from the Atlantic Ocean, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that one. But this is basically our knowledge on reproduction and the reproductive biology of oceanic white tips.
Okay, thank you. Another question, there were a couple questions around the pilot fish. That's actually a question I have myself. Sometimes you have so many of them and sometimes none. Do we know any reason for that? And one person asked the interesting question is, if these pilot fish travel with the sharks, do they travel with the sharks for life? or, you know, is it certain phases of the year? I guess it's a similar question.
Yeah, I mean, there was I had a conversation with the researcher years back that said they wanted to look into if there's any kind of systematics. How many paddlefish does an oceanic have? What does it say about potentially their lifestyle? When did they last basically also meet other sharks? Because generally oceanics are solitary. I've personally seen oceanics basically passing pilotfish to one another when they're encountering each other. So there was definitely a change of pilotfish from one shark to the other. And also I've personally seen individual sharks at some point with lots of oceanic, with lots of pilotfish, and then with others where they had none or hardly any. And that was the same individual within a few days, potentially even. So some people were sort of guessing that the number of pilotfish might be related to the time spent in the open ocean without encountering any other sharks or any other structures. But as far as I know, the systematic research has never happened. So for life, that would surprise me. As I said, I've seen changes. And I've seen the same shark with either a lot of pilotfish or the next day there was two. So there is apparent big changes from one day to the other. But that is as far as my knowledge goes. So partially anecdotal personal observations and lack of actually reference points or literature that I've come across.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask one sort of group of questions, people asking how they can help. So I will provide them with your contact detail so they can send in their fins. But somebody asked as well if there's an ability to donate to your cause. I think that's possible on your website, right?
Yes, Whitetip Sharks obviously has a website, whitetipsharks.org, and again, all this information we can make available. And yes, there's a chance to donate. There is also a donation path via a monthly subscription if anybody wants to adopt any of the identified sharks. So that is just a matter of contacting me, emailing me, and I can make sharks available. So that is another option. So yeah, donations are good, but of course, yeah, underwater footage is awesome. And as you mentioned before, Simon, this could be from any year. All I need with the pictures that I send in is the information, where they were taken, which dive site, and when they were taken. So this can be emailed. If it's video files, they can be sort of retransfer, anything like this. So anything like this would be hugely helpful to help us understand about the movement and the abundance of these predators here in Egypt. So that would be great.
Somebody asked if they take a photo of an oceanic white tip somewhere else, not in the Red Sea. So where could they send that? Like Shark Trust, or is there anybody else who does that?
There is no global sighting program for them. And again, the only other people that are actually studying sharks, but that was more tagging. So I'm not sure if they even started with a proper ID catalog in the Bahamas, actually. Bahamas is a bit, I don't know. As I said, I'm aware of tagging studies there, but not really of ID studies. I know that some of the local operators are recognizing sharks because they have a high rate of like basically sight fidelity. They're coming back. So they recognize them, but I'm not sure that is officially organized. So unlike, let's say, for manta rays and whale sharks, there is no global sighting program for them. So I'd be happy to look at them. I had a guest of mine that went to the Maldives and came across an oceanic and sent me the picture. Now, of course, it would have been pure luck that this is one that was actually here in Egypt, and it wasn't. Next step along would actually be Seychelles or something. So I'm quite happy to look at this, but there's nobody else, as far as I'm aware, that does ID studies with oceanics. So even if I don't use them now, I'm happy to collect it if something like this ever happened, to then pass it on. So don't delete them. Yeah. Don't just let them sit there on their laptops. Send them to me. There's no other place in the moment. And then I can check, first of all, if by pure luck it is one of the Egyptian oceanics, or potentially in the future somebody else looks at the movement with the help of their photo ID.
Okay, I think those were the biggest questions, just so it doesn't get too long. I just wanted to point out, guys, we have a few really interesting talks coming up about corals and coral reefs and fisheries, with focus on the Pacific. That's a professor from Guam. We also have Andy Cornish from the World Wildlife Fund, who might be able to talk a bit more about conservation sort of on a global level. He's the worldwide responsible for shark and ray conservation with the World Wildlife Fund. That's next, in 10 days or so. We also have a couple really cool talks in different topics. We have a professional videographer coming on Monday. Next Thursday, we have our tech insider talking about how to get into tech. We also got a really cool talk coming up end of next week by somebody who has a lot of humpback behavioral footage. It's going to share how humpbacks feed and what they do, etc. So we have lots of these kind of talks. If you want to support us doing these webinars, we're obviously providing these for free. If you want to help and support us, you can find us under this link. I will send an email as well. In the email that I'll send to you guys, I will also have the link to the donation area so you can support Elke and her work. So that would be great if you want to consider helping her in this time. I will ask Elke to recommend some books or resources that several of you asked for that. I will ask her to give me that so I can share that with everybody. Also, I will send the link to her database so you can see already what oceanic white tip sharks she has already identified. And finally, I will give the email address of Elke so that all of you can send in your pictures of the fins that you have collected and send them to her so she can even make an improved database as she already has. The more photos, the better. I hear a lot of talk about the other side of the Red Sea, so immediately try to take photos. Elke can take any kind of photo and use that to help grow the database. And so, yeah, we can all help together. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Please follow us particularly on YouTube, our channel. If you subscribe, you will see we have a lot of talks there that already happened. So you can spend a lot of time learning about photography and sharks and manta rays and so on. So please follow us there. We also have a community on Facebook where we just exchange interesting things about scuba diving and animals and so on. So if you want to join that, you're also welcome. So I would like to thank Elke for her time and this amazing talk. Everybody would be applauding if such a thing would exist here, but Elke, you did a really fabulous job. Thanks again. Learned again something, although I have heard many of your talks already. I always learn something new, so thank you very, very much. We're seeing here in the chat lots of grateful people thanking, and yeah, hope to see you guys somewhere else, and let's hope that we can dive very soon. And with that, I would like to wish you a very nice evening. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, please, Elke, sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity, Simon. And yeah, thanks for everybody that attended. I think they're pretty much on the way out now. So I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, new medium for me, but yeah, that was actually very nice.
Yeah, and you did well with the technology. So for a first time, didn't seem like it was a first time.
Thank you.
Okay, so then have a nice rest of the day, everybody. Or like if you're here in Asia like me, a good night, and stay safe, and see you all in the ocean someday.
Hopefully. See you soon.
Bye, Elke.
Bye.